how do we read prophetic pronouncements when we're looking at Scripture? There's this account where Jesus is with his disciples, and he teaches them on, the signs of the end times. They're recorded in all three Gospels. Today we're going to look at Mark's account, which is found in Mark chapter 13. If I could set up the scene. So here's the scene that Mark gives to us, and Matthew and Luke as well. Jesus is leaving the temple area, and the disciples remarked to Jesus, look at the size of the stones. They were marveling at the temple structure. And in response to that, Jesus says, and I'll just read from the passage, he says, "Do you see all these great buildings?" Jesus is motioning to the temple structure. He says, "Not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Okay, Jesus drops the mic.
Right.
And, and they carry on. Well, Then Mark picks up at verse 3. Later on, they've left the temple, they've gone down and up again the other side to the Mount of Olives, where they have now a view of the temple from a distance. And Jesus is sitting with his disciples, and Peter, James, and John, and Andrew come to Jesus, kind of, can we talk to you? So they ask him, tell us when these things happen and what will be the sign that they're about to be fulfilled. So what happens next?
Yeah, Jesus replies, and he says, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them."
Okay, so clearly at this point, everything Jesus has said seems to be applicable to the disciples. The temple's being destroyed, they're going to be arrested, brought before synagogue rulers. Those are kind of their concerns. So does this have anything to do with us, would be the question. Because in the immediate, so if you just to understand a little bit about the history, what's interesting here is that scholars are in general agreement that the writing of Mark takes place somewhere between 60 and 65 AD. What Jesus is speaking about in terms of its immediate fulfillment actually takes place in 70 AD, when Israel rebels against Rome, and Rome then sends their army to surround Jerusalem and ends up sacking Jerusalem. And in the process, the temple is completely destroyed, right? If you go to Jerusalem today, there's no temple there. There's just one small piece left that the Jews, observe. That's the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, sometimes referred to.
Sure.
But in terms of the Temple Mount, there's nothing on top of it. There's nothing built there. It was leveled. Jesus' prediction immediately becomes true, right? That's an historical fact.
Right.
And he's warning them. But again, now the warning now seems to broaden in scope beyond just the destruction of the temple and what the immediate disciples were going to face. When we think of prophecy, we often think of just the strict prediction, like Nostradamus, right? That's the kind of, I have a vision and this is going to happen and now this specific thing. Well, that's not really how we can understand fulfillment of biblical prophecy. That often it's a big discussion. We don't have time to get into all of it, but only to say that when we read biblical prophecy, that there are often, layers of fulfillment. And indeed, that is what's happening. And one of the things that, as commentators point out in Mark here, is that grammatically, the disciples ask Jesus when these things will take place, these things being the destruction of the temple. And grammatically throughout, he says, watch out when these things happen, these things, when you see these things. And grammatically, Jesus is pointing back. But then starting in verse 14, his language shifts from these things now to in those days. And it seems now that's where he's looking more broadly in those days.
Right.
And so now he's still speaking to the immediate, but now there seems to be a broader connotation, a more universal one, especially when you get down to verse 24. He says, but in those days following that distress, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Now
Right.
there's something cosmic going on that certainly doesn't fit with the description of this localized historic event of the fall of Jerusalem. Right. The foundations of the earth were not shaken. The stars did not fall from the sky. Right. It was not a cosmic event, but Jesus now seems to be pointing to one. Here's an example. Here's an example that most of our listeners and viewers might be familiar with. Right. In Isaiah 7, God tells King Ahaz that he's going to rescue Israel, that he doesn't need to worry. Here's the sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son. Before he is able to tell the good, right from wrong or even speak his name, right, the king of Damascus, the kingdom of Damascus and Samaria will fall. Right. That's the promise.
Okay.
Well, Shawn, the virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son. You think immediately of what?
Jesus.
Right.
Yep.
That's Jesus, right? Ahaz was getting a prediction of Jesus. Well, no, that's not what Isaiah had in mind, because God was giving to Ahaz a sign so that he would know in the immediate, right, that God was with them. And here was the sign. And then in Isaiah chapter 8, we then get the explanation or the fulfillment of the sign, at least in the immediate. Isaiah's wife, he goes to his wife, and his wife gets pregnant and has a baby. And by the time that child was weaned, indeed, Damascus and Samaria, actually, I think Egypt intervened. It might have been Egypt or Assyria. And Damascus and Samaria, they had to take their attention off Judea, off of Jerusalem, because suddenly they were defending themselves. And that was the end of Ahaz's problems with respect to them. Well, so it had an immediate fulfillment. But of course, come the time of Christ, right? Matthew's looking at the event of Jesus' birth and Jesus being born now to Mary, the Virgin. And he sees this as, if that was God, a sign, that was the immediate fulfillment of God's sign that he was with his people. Here now is the ultimate fulfillment. Like here is the fulfillment of all fulfillments, that indeed God is with us. Here's how we know he's with us. Now this virgin has given birth to a son, right? Yeah. Here's God's promise to deliver us and send a Messiah. So all that to say is, just like in Isaiah's prophecy, there was this immediate fulfillment, but then a much broader sense of fulfillment that would come. Jesus is talking about the temple, but now his words start to do the same.